There are cases that cannot withstand the test of time, but there are others that the older they get, the heavier the shadow they cast. And before this story begins, the researcher leaves only one simple request, almost whispered in the archives themselves. Comment on which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. Perhaps because every investigation begins with a point in time, and someone willing to look at it head-on. Among the long winters that marked eastern Tennessee at the end of the 19th century, few documents are as recurrent and as uncomfortable as those that mention the Cumberland widow's snow chamber, a makeshift underground room used as an emergency shelter by travelers surprised by the sudden storms that swept the region between December and March. The most complete account from that time describes the winter of 1890 as one of the harshest since the fires of 1871. Local newspapers reported that the wind blowing down from the Cumberland Hills screamed like wood being twisted, and that dry snow covered the region like dust, accumulating in suffocating layers on trails, small farms, and isolated barns. It is against this backdrop that the core of the story emerges. A group of 20 horsemen, merchants, 2 railroad messengers, 3 brothers from the Knoxville area, and anonymous men who traveled between counties carrying supplies, medicine, or just news. None of them appear together in official records. Their names only intersect because they were on the same route on the same day, crossing the Cumberland Plateau toward the Powell River Valley. The oldest chronicle of the case, written in 1904 by a Claiborne County recorder, describes the 20 men as weary faces, restless mounts, and steps marked by the haste to escape the storm that was already forming in the skies. The researcher responsible for reconstructing this account states that, looking at the manuscripts, it feels as if each of those signatures was left with hands already swollen from the cold. At that time, few travelers went alone when snow threatened to close the roads. The widow Eleanor Harrow, owner of a small wooden house built on worn stones, was known for offering hot coffee and shelter to passers-by. Her own story seemed marked by the harshness of the region. She had lost her husband and 2 children in a mine collapse just over 10 years earlier. Since then, she had lived off the land, raising a few goats and welcoming riders in need of rest. But there was something unique about her property, and it was precisely this detail that would become central to the case. Eleanor's house had an underground compartment, structured with horizontal logs, which retained heat and served as a makeshift refuge during the most violent snowstorms. It was no bigger than a small barn, and was not designed to accommodate many people at once. Still, it was the closest safe haven for those who crossed that isolated part of the mountains. On January 17, 1890, shortly before 3 in the afternoon, according to one of the last telegrams sent before the lines went down, the storm changed its behavior. Winds tore the snow obliquely, to the point that experienced riders reported that their horses were already shivering before the air actually froze. Testimonies collected later confirm that small groups of travelers spontaneously joined together, attempting to cross the final stretch connecting the Redwater Trail to the valley where the widow's property was located. Records indicate that the 20 riders arrived at Eleanor's property between late afternoon and early evening, exhausted, covered in ice, and with their clothes stiffened by frozen moisture. A partial note, found on the back of an old receipt, describes the scene as, "They arrived in silence, like men who had already seen the worst of the road. Eleanor asked them to wait while she heated water. One of them fell to his knees as he entered. The storm, however, had not passed. On the contrary, it had intensified. Faced with imminent danger, the widow led the travelers to the underground chamber known as the snow chamber. It was too small for so many men, but it was the only safe place. Inside, according to later records, there were a few oil lamps, thick blankets, and a small barrel of water. This is the last point confirmed in all historical documents. The 20 horsemen entered the snow chamber and were never seen again. The widow Eleanor Harrow opened the door again the next morning, and what she found there did not appear in full in any of the archives, only fragments, truncated descriptions, erased reports, and contradictory statements. What is known is that the men were no longer there, and nothing, absolutely nothing, indicated how they could have left amid meters of untouched snow. One of the county recorders summed it up in a desperately vague line. They went in. They warmed their hands. After that, the story is lost. And it is precisely in this void, in this impossible absence, that the mystery of this case begins. Reconstructing the daily lives of the 20 horsemen before that winter of 1890 requires navigating scattered fragments, hastily sent letters, trading post notes, small railroad records, and belated accounts from family members who, decades later, were still trying to understand what had happened. But it is precisely in these broken pieces of memory that the most human and most silent portrait of the men who would disappear in the snow chamber emerges. Most of them were not adventurers, but ordinary workers. Jonas Whitley, for example, was 42 years old and known in neighboring counties for transporting homemade medicines produced by his wife, who had fallen ill after her last childbirth. There is a letter dated January 4th in which he writes, "I'll be back before the end of the month, wind permitting. I need to sell 5 more boxes. Give the girls a kiss for me." It was the last message his family received. Brothers Caleb, Matthew, and Joel Harriman from Knoxville were described as inseparable since the collapse of the railroad bridge in 1885, when they lost their father. They worked delivering tools and small packages to sawmills scattered throughout the hills. According to the records of a merchant in Redwater Hollow, the 3 seemed restless in the week leading up to the storm. They looked at the sky more often than usual, he noted. There was no objective reason for this. Perhaps it was just the practical experience of those who had seen many winters close roads without warning. Among the travelers was also Thomas Dighton, a 29-year-old railroad messenger. His diary, found months later at a bean station sale, contained sparse notes about temperature changes in the region. On January 15th, he wrote only, "The air burns before it freezes. That's never a good sign." This fragment would become one of the clues most cited by later investigators. There is also the case of Elliot Crane, a man who traveled alone and whose name barely appears in the archives. The only reliable description comes from a statement taken in 1897 by an amateur researcher. He walked as if carrying questions. He didn't talk much, but he listened to everything. Elliot was one of the last people to be seen in the stable of the Widow Harrow, helping to dry the horses' manes under dim oil lamps. The daily lives of these men, though simple, were permeated by the small pressures of the time. Agricultural debts, deliveries delayed by December rains, the instability of the new railroad lines advancing into the interior, and the constant fear of respiratory diseases that spread with the cold. Many were on the road because they could not afford to wait for the winter to improve. Rural life in Tennessee and on the Virginia border rarely offered much choice. Records also show that the travelers did not arrive at the widow's property together. Small groups formed along the trails, united more by necessity than by affinity. 3 of them met at the old Powell Ridge junction, where snow was already beginning to fall in dense flakes. A 4th group approached hours later, guided by lanterns that barely overcame the wind. The last trio, apparently consisting of 2 unknown horsemen and a young blacksmith's apprentice, would have followed the trail of footprints left by the first group before the snow completely erased them. Testimonies from local residents mention that, even in the morning, dogs barked restlessly at the sudden change in air pressure. On nearby farms, windows rattled as if someone were banging on them with their hands. A farmer named Henry Lowell reported years later that he saw a white wall coming down the hills, silent and fast, covering the trees before he could even run to gather his cattle. These signs, which at the time seemed like mere natural warnings, would take on greater significance when crossed with the approximate time when the 20 horsemen decided to speed up their march. It was unlikely, almost reckless, that they would attempt to cross the most open part of the plateau at the risk of a snowstorm. But in that region, hesitation was also dangerous. The lack of shelter on the trails exposed travelers to rapid freezing. Eleanor Harrow's house, with its reinforced underground compartment, had become a kind of beacon of hope for those who needed to reach the valley that week. The widow herself appears in several testimonies. She was described as a thin woman, hardened by age but generous. A neighbor claimed to have seen constant smoke coming out of the chimney throughout the 17th, a sign that Eleanor was heating water and preparing the space for possible travelers stranded by bad weather. This image, a lonely woman organizing blankets and lighting the small shelter to the growing sound of the wind, is one of the last reconstructions considered reliable before the disappearance. Despite this, some reports indicate discreetly unusual behavior throughout that day. One of them, recorded by a man who had passed by the site hours earlier, states that Eleanor repeatedly asked if he had seen large groups on the road, as if she were already expecting a larger number of travelers. Another neighbor said that the widow kept lanterns lit on the porch even before nightfall, an unusual practice for someone so economical with kerosene. There is no consensus on the meaning of these details. To the modern researcher, they sound like minor deviations from the norm, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest that something on that day was moving the gears of fate to an unusual point. What the archives make clear, almost cruelly, is that nothing seemed to foreshadow what would happen inside the snow chamber. The riders were exhausted, yes, the cold was intense, no doubt, but they all found shelter, warmth, and some relief when they arrived at the widow Harrow's house. They ate fresh bread, according to a later testimony. Some held mugs of hot water in both hands, as if to restore blood to their fingers. One of them reportedly dozed off while sitting, before being awakened to go down to the shelter. At the dawn of that night, everything indicated that the only danger would be the storm, and that at daybreak they would be alive, wet, tired, but safe. However, the documents stop there. From that moment on, the story descends into an uncomfortable silence, as if the records were avoiding what was to come. And even before the storm reached its peak, a fact, discrete but recurring, appears in two later statements. Someone commented, shortly before everyone went down to the shelter, that the wind seemed to come from under the ground. The archives do not explain what this meant, but it is the first note that foreshadows what, in the following hours, would be remembered as the most inexplicable disappearance of that winter. The hours leading up to the disappearance of the 20 horsemen are reconstructed almost as if they were frames from an old movie. Each testimony illuminates a piece. Each record adds a gesture, a shadow, a sound. The whole, however, remains fractured, and it is in this fracture that the silent force of the case lies. The storm reached its most aggressive point shortly after 9 o'clock at night. The wind blew so hard that it tore particles of ice from the trees and threw them against the walls of Widow Harrow's house, producing a rhythmic, harsh sound that some survivors of other snowstorms in the region describe as the crackling of collapsing wood. Inside the house, the atmosphere was stifling, dense, impregnated with steam from wet clothes and the smell of kerosene. The riders warmed their hands near the lamps, tried to massage their stiff muscles, and whispered to each other in hushed voices, as if afraid to disturb the silence that grew beneath the roar of the wind. According to a fragment found in the diary of Thomas Dayton, the railway messenger, someone said, "If the snow continues like this, we will be swallowed up by the road." Dayton does not mention who said the phrase, but the record indicates that the group was aware of the gravity of the situation. The widow, Eleanor, experienced enough to recognize the signs of a deadly winter, insisted that everyone go down to the snow chamber. The underground shelter maintained a more stable temperature and prevented the slanting winds from tearing off the main door of the house, something that had happened years before. One of the last visual accounts consists of a brief note written by a neighbor who took shelter in the widow's house 9 years later during another storm. He recorded that Eleanor had described the night of the disappearance as follows. They went down one by one. Each step made the floor shake. There is no confirmation that the phrase was said exactly that way, but the image it evokes, exhausted, heavy men carefully descending a narrow staircase, is consistent with what is known about the structure. The snow chamber consisted of a single room, reinforced with logs and compacted earth. The floor was made of uneven wood. On the sides, folded blankets were stacked on boxes. In one corner, there was a small makeshift stove, which was rarely lit so as not to quickly consume the oxygen in the room. Documents state that Eleanor distributed enough oil lamps to keep the room lit for a few hours. The 20 horsemen settled in as best they could. Some sat leaning against the walls, others remained standing, warming their hands, while some tried to remove the hardened snow from their boots. The dominant sound, according to a probable reconstruction, was that of the wind passing through the upper cracks, a constant, low whistle that vibrated as if the wood were breathing. It is at this point that the last consistent descriptions appear, all of them preserved in later reports. One of the knights, believed to be Caleb Harriman, is said to have knocked on the wall of the shelter and said, "The wind is strange today. It seems to change direction even inside the earth." Eleanor reportedly replied that this happened when the air outside was colder than underground, creating internal currents. It was a simple, plausible explanation in line with the practical knowledge of the time. Even so, this phrase would return frequently during the investigation. Shortly before the lamps began to dim, there is a record of collective behavior that is difficult to interpret. Two late testimonies mention that the knights were completely silent for a few minutes, as if they had all heard the same sound coming from outside, something between a crack and a deep shifting of heavy snow. There is no unanimous confirmation of this information, but it is repeated often enough to suggest that something did, in fact, alter the climate inside the snow chamber. From this point on, the archives plunge into uncomfortable gaps. It is known that Eleanor went upstairs to check the intensity of the storm and reinforce the main door. When she returned to the staircase, the wind was roaring so loudly that it was difficult to hear any sound coming from underground. Still, she claimed to have heard muffled voices, as if the group were discussing something, not in a tone of argument, but as if trying to understand a new, urgent, unforeseen problem. Some investigators believe that, at that moment, some kind of structural displacement caused by the weight of the snow occurred. Could a crack in the shelter's ceiling have frightened the knights? There is no clear evidence, but the subject has been explored extensively in subsequent analyses. The key point, however, is that Eleanor did not go down immediately. She waited about 10 minutes, perhaps longer, before returning to the underground chamber. Those minutes represent the greatest void in history. When the widow finally went down, close to midnight, the records become vague, fragmented, almost always written with hesitation. The door to the snow chamber was locked from the inside, as it should be, but when she opened it, Eleanor found the interior lit only by a dying lamp, and none of the 20 horsemen. The blankets were scattered, but not violently. The boot marks on the floor, however, seemed to stop short of the door. The water barrel was upright. The boxes leaning against the walls remained in place. There was no sign of digging, of a hasty escape, of structural collapse. And there were no footprints outside, none. The snow piled up on the ground was untouched, smooth as a blank sheet of paper. Some documents mention that Eleanor cried out for the men, calling them by the name she remembered. Other records contradict this, saying that she remained in absolute silence, unable to comprehend what she saw. What is known with a greater degree of certainty is that she went up to the house in a state of shock, lit all the lamps, and for some unknown reason left the front door unlocked, even with the wind blowing. This detail, the unlocked door, appears in 8 independent statements, and it makes the sequence of events even more difficult to reconcile with any logical explanation. Between midnight and 3 a.m., neighbors hundreds of yards away reported seeing lights flickering in the widow's house as if she were pacing back and forth, unable to sit or rest. At 3:40 a.m., the wind began to die down. At 4:15 a.m., according to her own account 2 days later, Eleanor went back down to the shelter. Nothing had changed. The room remained empty. The lamp was out. The air was still, cold, with no smell of smoke or burnt kerosene. This second descent marks the last direct record of the night. And this is where the case reaches its peak of tension in the archives, ending the block with the most disturbing and completely realistic evidence that exists. Among the boxes of blankets, Eleanor found an object that did not belong to her, a worn leather hat, stained with melted snow. On it was an old, perfectly circular burn mark that one of the Harriman brothers used to carry as a scar from a blacksmithing accident. The hat was there, but Joel, its owner, was nowhere to be found. Later, in the official records, the description of the item would be accompanied by a single sentence written by the lead investigator. The body may disappear. The hat does not lie. And it was this silent evidence, forgotten on the cold floor of the snow chamber, that would end attempts to rationally explain what had happened on that early morning in 1890, and pave the way for the desperate investigations of the following days. The first hours after dawn on January 18, 1890, became, over the decades, a mosaic of human reactions. Fear, disbelief, anger, search, silence. The news that the widow Eleanor Harrow had opened the door of Snow Chamber and found none of the 20 horsemen spread through the neighboring valleys like a whisper that no one wanted to repeat, but that everyone ended up repeating. The first to arrive was Henry Lowell, the farmer who lived just over half a mile from the property. He stated in a formal statement that he found Eleanor sitting on the porch, holding an unlit lamp in both hands. The door to the house was ajar. Her expression, according to Henry, was like someone waiting for the world to make sense again. He asked about the travelers. The widow just shook her head. Lowell went down to the shelter. He examined the floor, the boxes, the barrel, the remains of the lamps, the blankets. He confirmed that there were no signs of escape, nor any sign of collapse. Only the burnt hat, a detail that at that moment did not seem to have the weight it would later gain in reports. As he left, Henry noticed something that would be repeatedly cited by later investigators. The surrounding snow cover was completely intact, with no cracks, tracks, marks, or alterations. Neither humans nor animals had passed through there since the night before. It was as if the ground had been sealed by dawn. Shortly thereafter, 2 merchants arrived from Redwater, followed by a blacksmith from Cumberland Gap and a mail carrier who was trying to resume service on the route. With each new visitor, the perplexity grew. Some went down to the shelter and left in silence. Others asked if Eleanor had been mistaken about the number of men. She had not. Around 11 a.m., neighbors organized small, improvised expeditions, walking in concentric circles around the property. They searched for any trace, tracks of men who had tried to leave during the night, skid marks, bloodstains, ropes, fallen objects. They found nothing. In the afternoon, when the storm finally subsided, authorities from Claiborne and Hancock counties arrived on the scene. Sheriff Marshal Wentford, who oversaw rural investigations in the region, was put in charge of the case. His initial report, preserved thanks to a copy sent to the state office, describes the scene in almost clinical terms. The travelers entered a safe, dry, and well-lit place. The only exit is the same one they entered. No signs of structural damage, no evidence of internal strife, no external traces. An unusual case, with no indication of obvious crime. This excerpt raises a question that has accompanied the case to this day. How to conduct an investigation when there is not even a starting point to follow. The snow chamber was examined by men more experienced in rural structures. One of them, retired builder Arthur Merrigan, stated that the wood showed signs of natural compression, but nothing that indicated collapse. There were no openings in the ceiling, holes in the walls, or cracks wide enough to allow any exit from the bottom. The floor was intact. The technical conclusion was clear. No one could have left through there without leaving marks on the floor or structure. Meanwhile, family members began to arrive. Jonas Whitley's wife brought with her the letters he had written. Elliot Crane's brothers tried to understand why their relative was on the road that day, since he was not on any known itinerary. The expressions that were repeated were almost always the same. He was coming back. He wouldn't do anything reckless. Someone was waiting for him. In the testimonies, the human dimension of the case emerged as a long, painful shadow. As night approached again, the community divided into 2 groups. Those who believed that the riders had been victims of some silent and extreme accident, perhaps a sudden fissure in the ground, unusual burial, or deep snow displacement. and those who, unable to accept the total absence of traces, sought explanations in old rumors from the region, involving abandoned mines, forgotten tunnels, passages dug decades earlier by fugitive slaves or salt smugglers. The investigators, however, rejected any hypothesis that had no physical basis. Wentford wrote, "The ground has been probed. There are no underground galleries, no nearby mines, no records of ancient passages. Nothing indicates recesses under Mrs. Harrow's property." Still, rumors persisted, fueled by Eleanor's own silence, as she seemed increasingly frail. There are reports that she avoided entering the snow chamber after the second day of searching. She preferred to sit on the porch, watching the snow melt slowly, as if waiting for something to return as it descended the hill. The following days were marked by systematic searches. Men with long poles pierced the snow at regular intervals, trying to identify hidden cavities. Dog breeders brought animals trained to track human scents, but nothing was found. Once again, the records are unanimous. The ground remained silent, untouched, impenetrable. The central revelation of the case, the one that, for many historians, defines the line between search and resignation, occurs in Chief Constable Wentford's final report, written 10 days after the disappearance. He states, "The evidence suggests that the men did not leave, but logic suggests that they could not remain. This case rests between these two impossibilities." And then he adds a remark that is rarely quoted outside academic circles. "If there was a choice, it is not documented. If there was a failure, it left no marks. What remains is only the interval between one night and nothingness." For many family members, this sentence sounded like a sentence, not a conclusion. But it was on this basis that the investigation was closed due to a lack of reliable clues. Decades later, a new line of interpretation would emerge. That the 20 horsemen may have been victims of a unique combination of factors: exhaustion, initial hypothermia, disorientation, and collective panic, leading to a disorganized departure during the height of the storm. This hypothesis, although plausible, faces the same obstacle it faced in 1890. There are no footprints, no tracks, no marks indicating external movement. The harshest and most human truth is that the community had to continue living, even without answers. Farms were rebuilt, roads reinforced, and subsequent winters faced with new precautions. But the case of the 20 horsemen never completely disappeared. It remained in the stories told in dim light, in church meetings, in the archives that slowly burned under the touch of time. The widow Eleanor Harrow died in 1903. Among her belongings, they found a single note, preserved inside a wooden box. "I saw them come in. I saw the tired eyes, and I waited to see them leave." This is, for many historians, the most honest revelation of the case. Not an explanation, but a confession that some human events remain unattainable, not for lack of logic, but for an excess of silence. And it is precisely in this silence that the last trace lies. An absence so complete that it challenges even the memory of the community itself. Eleanor left no theories, assumptions, or justifications. She left only what she had seen, and what she had not seen again. Decades later, when the archives had yellowed and the region's memory seemed to have settled under other stories and other winters, the case of the 20 horsemen continued to surface in the most unexpected corners. In discreet conversations on the porches of Powell Valley, in footnotes to research on rural meteorology, in testimonies from descendants who inherited only fragments of the original narrative. No version was complete. None fully answered the questions left by that early morning. It was only in the late 1930s that a historian named Lucien Barrow, then a traveling researcher for the State Archives, decided to revisit all available documents. For 2 years he traveled to farms, sought out family members, revisited courts, and examined every piece of paper that had withstood moisture and time. His notebooks, now stored in boxes without precise identification, became the main basis for this reconstruction. Barrow stated that when studying such old cases, one should not expect absolute answers. Rather, one should seek the human outline of the facts. He wrote, "History is not made up only of events, but of the empty space they leave behind. It was this emptiness that the historian found repeatedly as he reconstructed the rider's route, the functioning of the snow chamber, Eleanor Harrow's routine, and the community's reactions. And he noticed something that was not in the original reports, but which echoed silently among the older residents. The disappearance did not only change the lives of the families involved, it changed the way the region understood winter itself. Until then, snow had been seen as a predictable enemy, a natural element that one learned to negotiate with. After that January 1890, it took on another dimension. No longer a direct threat, but a symbol of what is lost without warning, without witnesses, without a trace. A symbol of what human memory cannot hold. In Barrow's notes, there are also observations about the widow Eleanor. Although many official reports deal only with facts, the historian sought what he called the human gesture behind the witness. It was discovered that in the last years of her life, Eleanor avoided talking about the case but never denied what she had seen. She repeated from time to time that the storm swallows sounds that it never returns. Barrow interpreted this phrase not as a metaphor, but as a lament. Throughout his research, the historian tried to understand why this disappearance, among so many others that occurred in the 19th century, continued to cause particular discomfort. It was not the number of people, although 20 horsemen was an exceptional number. It was not the severity of the winter, for there had been worse storms. What made the case so persistent was the impossible consistency between the testimonies. They entered the shelter, the door was closed, the structure remained intact. No alternative exit existed, no external marks were found, nothing was heard, nothing was seen. The complete absence of contradictions, paradoxically, made the case even more difficult to accept. Barrow concluded that there are episodes in history that do not stand up to logical dissection because they were not made to fit into a single type of explanation. They belong to the realm of extreme human losses, those in which time does not leave enough evidence to reconstruct the event, and where, therefore, each fragment becomes ruin. He wrote in his final analysis, "It's not that there is no answer. It's that the answer was buried along with the footprints that never appeared." Over the decades, documents were lost, families moved away, and the Tennessee landscape changed. The snow house disappeared, swallowed up by subsequent renovations and natural erosion. The widow's house was demolished in 1921. The land, reorganized for cultivation, no longer bears any trace of what happened there. And yet, when it snows in the region, some older residents say the silence becomes heavier, not out of superstition, but out of remembrance. Lucian Barrow's last known note, written in 1941, discreetly ends his research. The archivist copied it by hand, perhaps recognizing its power. Some cases persist not because they have answers, but because they carry questions that time can no longer correct. And that is where this account ends, not with an explanation, but with the honesty that the documents allow. The 20 horsemen arrived at the property seeking shelter. They were seen entering the snow chamber. They were expected in the morning, and they never left. Nothing remained but the burnt hat, the record of the extinguished lanterns, and the memory of a woman who watched tired men cross the entrance to a shelter from which no one returned. And if there is anything that remains, perhaps the only solid residue of this case, it is the feeling that certain absences do not belong to the realm of the extraordinary, but to the deeply human, the kind of silence that time does not resolve, but only preserves. And it is in this silence that the story ends.